Good evening, everyone. I'd like to take this time to thank Chairman Robert Scott of the Education and Labor Committee for inviting me, a 22-year-old Black man from Baltimore County, Maryland, to testify before Congress. Additionally, I'd like to thank the following subcommittees and bodies for attending this hearing: the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for African Americans, the President's Advisory Commission on Hispanic Prosperity, and the President's Board of Advisors on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. I am here today to address the issue of higher education affordability in the United States of America. I am here to address this issue from a lens that is often used by social activists and Afrofuturists in efforts to undo systemic oppression at various levels of government. I am here to acknowledge that the exorbitant cost of a college degree in the United States is an example of systemic oppression at the regional, state, and federal levels. The $1.7 trillion student debt crisis disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, and Latinx ethnic groups. The current cost of an American degree for American citizens is not only an impediment to the liberation and social mobility of peoples from these groups, but it is also a punishment to those who enroll, persist, and are left holding the bill. This testimony will first consist of a critique of our higher education model and how it functions as capitalist, individualist, and exclusionary. Secondly, I will make the case for how the elimination of student debt and tuition costs for all U.S. citizens is a speculative and anti-racist intervention. Lastly, I will challenge all of us in this room, collectively, to reimagine the role of higher education in American society by considering what we aspire for ourselves, our loved ones, and our nation. Before I continue, I'd like to bring awareness to the groups that are already undertaking this work to liberate Black and brown people through free education. There are too many organizations and individual people to name, but I'd like to thank the Critical Resistance Abolitionist Educators, Imagining America, and the NAACP for doing this work. The problems that are caused by the cost of college are endemic in America. Approximately 45 million people in the United States are collectively burdened with $1.7 trillion in student loans. However, Black and Indigenous groups shoulder a disproportionate amount of the $1.7 trillion in student loans. The average Black college graduate in America can expect to pay $25,000 more in student debt than the average white graduate. Viewers at home may assume that this total is a result of Black students' greater financial need. However, if we look at the graduates 20 years after graduation, the average Black borrower still owes 95% of their student debt, while the average white borrower only owes about 5% of their student debt after 20 years. The gap between the amount that the average Black borrower owes in 20 years and that of the average white borrower is 90%. Indigenous populations are also greatly affected by student debt. 70% of Indigenous borrowers owe at least $25,000 in student debt, compared to just half of white student loan borrowers. Many Black and Indigenous borrowers struggle more than white borrowers to pay their student loans due to decreased access to public universities, wage discrimination based on race and gender, and the lack of financial support from parents that white students often have and Black and Indigenous students often lack. But the nexus of all of these causes is the extreme cost of attending college. Black and Indigenous students pay more but get less on their investment. Public colleges in America spend $5 billion less on Black students than they do white students. When Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students are saddled with student debt, they often face mental health challenges that affect them personally and academically. I identify with these challenges, as my student debt has caused anxiety attacks, along with feelings ranging from frustration to guilt to apathy and numbness about my educational journey. Now, there was a time in which these student-facing challenges did not exist, a time in which white men were the overwhelming demographic on U.S. campuses. But after the passing of the Higher Education Act in 1965, State funding for colleges decreased, and the money coming out of students' pockets for college increased. This was instituted as an intentional barrier meant to prohibit Black and brown students from attending college, as white students could more easily front the cost. To undo this funding structure built in the name of white supremacy is to acknowledge the racist nature of the system and to provide an anti-racist solution. Now, the goal here is not equality. The goal here is equity and policy that centers anti-racism. I like to cite the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the most brilliant education philosophers we've had. A Du Boisian framework for educational transformation is one in which reform starts with and across historically white institutions, most of which consist of private and expensive land-grant universities. The first step, and perhaps the first result of this type of reform, is to make historically white public and private institutions more penetrable to Black and brown students by eliminating tuition costs at these institutions. When we allow Black and brown students to exist at what are currently our most expensive colleges, only then will we begin to unseat systemic racism in higher education. Again, the goal here is not equality. The goal here is equity and policy that centers on anti-racism. Eliminating racial inequities in higher education would boost our economy by $956 billion annually. What this tells us is that our Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students are worthy of equitable investment, just like we've always been. The cost of college is just one of the barriers that we've had to clear on our way to becoming contributing members of society. Our ability to evade this inequity shows our ability to survive. But in the words of Black female abolitionist teacher and author Bettina Love, quote, "We want to do more than survive." Again, the goal is not equality. The goal is equity and policy that centers anti-racism. There are many things about the American context that complicates the economics of higher education, such as the National College Athletics Association, which would not function without the unpaid labor of mostly Black athletes in the stolen land on which they perform. Another complicator is the prison industrial complex, a system that in some states receives 6 times the state funding that colleges receive. With the elimination of student debt and tuition costs nationwide, we would strengthen the case for paying Division I athletes for their labor and weaken the prison industrial complex. When we make education more accessible, less people will commit crimes that are deemed worthy of punishment. If the committees present are passionate about Hispanic prosperity, the educational excellence of African Americans, and the future of learning and labor, we must work to make tuition free at all U.S. universities, not just public colleges. We must put pressure on states to defund the prison industrial complex and put those funds toward our K-16 educational systems. We must divorce our profit-generating relationships in academia to maintain the nonprofit nature the nonprofit nature and the nonprofit status of our institutions. We must raise the minimum wage across the country, particularly in the southern and midwestern United States, so that college is not viewed as the only ticket to a middle-class lifestyle. We must devise a more ethical method of selecting students for college admission and bake these methods into new state accreditation standards. And we must invest more equitably into tribal colleges, historically Black colleges, and Hispanic serving institutions so that students who need the most financial help do not have to pay to attend these schools. In closing, I'd like to share a personal story. Now, I'm a first-generation college student who was denied by every state university that I applied to. However, I am now pursuing my master's degree as a 22-year-old full-time degree-seeking student at Georgetown University, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. This may be a triumph, but in making this decision, I am now in 6-figure student debt. My academic journey is one filled with success and is still continuing. However, I recognize that without the financial assistance from my parents and others along the way, I could be telling a much different story. If we fast forward to the future, my student debt may prevent me from having children, or buying a home or a car, or starting a business, difficulties that are familiar for millions of adult borrowers today. But what if college was completely free for me? Perhaps I would have the financial freedom to fully engage in my studies instead of having to work 2 jobs simultaneously for years while routinely earning Dean's List honors as a full-time student in college, an experience that has caused my battles with anxiety and depression. Perhaps the outcome is different for a student who has the same talent, the same work ethic, and even the same skin color, but doesn't have the privilege that I grew up with. Imagine the physical, mental, emotional, and financial toll that this soul-murdering experience of being 6 figures in debt has on talented students who come from less. Now, maybe the stories of those sitting in this room would not change very much if college was free. But I challenge you all to imagine what free college could do for someone you know. How would free college affect those you know and love, whether they have, are, or want to attend college? If college was free, how would you tell the story of a student loan borrower that you know? What if instead of our universities using diversity and inclusion as a prop, they instead took the time to hear and amplify the voices of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students? I hope you join me in this listening and amplification. In 1954, after Brown versus Board desegregated schools by law, the U.S. Supreme Court stated that education is, quote, a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. I repeat, the U.S. Supreme Court stated that education is, quote, a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. It is time for the land of opportunity to live up to its promise. I thank you for your time, and I warmly welcome your questions.